the 19th of August 1942, as dawn was breaking along the coast of occupied France, a force of just over 6,000 men stormed the beaches around the port town of Dieppe in the first major Allied strike against Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Within a matter of minutes, hundreds lay dead or wounded, washed up against seawalls, hung on wire entanglements, or incinerated in the burning landing craft. Over 60% of the mainly Canadian assault force were killed, wounded, or captured by the end of the day. And the Dieppe Raid has, for the Allies, gone down as one of the most infamous days of the Second World War. Using the latest technology, satellite imaging, veteran accounts and contemporary footage taken by a German camera crew on that day, will follow Operation Jubilee's inexorable march towards disaster. By the summer of 1942, it was clear that the war wasn't going well for the Allies. In February, Singapore had fallen. 4 months later, Tobruk followed suit. And in Eastern Europe, the Red Army continued to crumble under the Wehrmacht's relentless advance. It was partly due to this that the Dieppe Raid took place. Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt were both concerned that their young alliance with the Soviet Union would fall apart if they didn't respond to Stalin's demands for a second front. Enter Combined Operations. Led by the charismatic Lord Louis Mountbatten, his force of commandos and specialist units had, since 1940, been a dagger thrust into the flanks of Nazi-held Europe. Launching a series of ever larger strikes from Norway to the French coast, they provided hope within a narrative of defeats. But with each victory at greater scale, the goalposts shifted. Combined Operations planners kept looking to outdo their last operation. Dieppe was to be the newest and largest of those efforts. By 1942, 177,000 Canadian volunteers had arrived in Britain, commanded by General Harry Crerar. He was painfully aware that his men were yet to see action. So, when General Montgomery outlined a brief sketch of a mission to Europe and said, "Do you want it?" Crerar replied, "You bet we want it." Thus, 5,000 men of the 2nd Canadian Division, commanded by General John Ham Roberts, descended on the Isle of Wight and began training, though few knew it, for an audacious reconnaissance in force, codenamed Operation Rutter. On the 3rd of July, there was excitement when, having marched up gangways to embark with the massed flotilla, the Canadians found out they were sailing across the channel to meet the enemy, and the target was Dieppe. Officers briefed their men, laying out the plan in full. However, foul weather caused a delay which ultimately led to cancellation. Roberts messaged his division saying, "It's with the deepest regret that I have to announce that our party is off." But why Dieppe? What advantage could have been gained by attacking this fishing port come holiday resort? The accepted wisdom is that Dieppe was chosen as a dress rehearsal in penetrating the Nazis' Atlantic Wall. And there's merit to this theory. It was a tough prospect, but not too tough. It had some attractive targets in the form of an inland airfield, a radar station, a harbour full of invasion barges, and crucially was within range of fighter bases in southern England. But none of this is really compelling enough to have warranted the scale of operation being planned. Even if we consider more recent theories of the raid, such as an Enigma code pinch raid, it's equally plausible that Dieppe was just the latest and most spectacular of Mountbatten's combined ops creations, driven to demonstrate aggressive intent to the Germans and show willing to the Soviets. So given Dieppe could hardly be described as strategically important, it was staggering that combined operations would break with security doctrine to remount it. Since Rutter's cancellation, 6,000 fully briefed troops have been carousing in pubs across the home counties. However, Mountbatten managed to use reverse logic to persuade Churchill and the chiefs that if, by some unexpected chance, the Germans had stumbled on Dieppe as our target, they would never for a moment think that we should be so idiotic as to remount the operation on the same target. So, with a few tweaks, remounted it was, now codenamed Operation Jubilee. The party was back on. Meanwhile, across the channel, German forces continued to strengthen their defences. By August, the Dieppe seafront was swathed in barbed wire and covered by guns with interlocking arcs and enfilade fire, all backed up by concrete emplacements and roadblocks. The defenders, mostly garrison troops from the German 302nd Division, were admittedly not the cream of the Wehrmacht, but despite that inexperience, they were prepared and determined. Their commander, General Haser, had them constantly training and sleeping in their boots at their posts on nights when moon and tide favoured invasion. Back in London, the plan was settled. There were to be 5 attacks launched on a front of 13 miles, with each given a colour-based code name. Furthest east were Yellow 1 and Yellow 2, a mile apart. Both were assigned to the British No. 3 Commando, who would go in early and take out a heavy gun battery codenamed Goebbels to stop it interfering with the main assault force. On the westernmost flank, a similar assault was to be made by No. 4 Commando, who were led by the singular character of Shimmy Fraser, Lord Lovat of later D-Day fame. Their task was to go in Orange 1 and 2 and neutralise Hess battery. The outer 2 flanks secured, the next focus was on the defences immediately east and west of Dieppe. About a mile to the east of the town, at a break in the cliffs, was Puy, or Blue Beach. Above the holiday resort here were the guns of Rommel battery, with arcs of fire over the port itself. They needed taking out if the main assault was to succeed, a task given to the Royal Regiment of Canada and Black Watch of Canada. 2 miles west of Dieppe lay Pourville, codenamed Green Beach. The South Saskatchewans were to land here and move south and east, taking out a radar station and western headland, before linking up the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, known to all as the Rileys, who were given the west side of Dieppe itself, landing on the town's main beach, codenamed White. Supporting them, the first wave of tanks crewed by the Calgary Regiment would grind ashore. To their left, the Essex Scottish would land at Red, joining the full frontal assault on Dieppe. Both Essex Scottish and the Rileys were tasked to penetrate the town before linking up with the flanking units on the east and west headlands respectively. Then, held back as an exploitation force were the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, who would land at Green, pass through the Saskatchewans and move to destroy this airfield 3 miles inland. Finally, held as a floating reserve were Les Fusiliers Mont-Royal. They were to go ashore once the town was secured to set up a perimeter defence allowing the whole force to withdraw. This was all to be achieved in about 2.5 hours. Of course, none of this would be possible without air cover. In fact, in the eyes of Fighter Command, the main show would be the air battle, not the amphibious assault. For them, the force landing on the beaches were the bait in an effort to draw the Luftwaffe into the air and smash them with Spitfires, Hurricanes and Typhoons. Of the 1,000 aircraft involved in Jubilee, more than 80% would be fighters. One RAF officer wrote, "What did it matter if the bait was devoured whole, as long as the fish, or rather the Luftwaffe, was properly hooked?" On Tuesday the 18th of August 1942, thousands of men boarded ships along the English coast. It wasn't until all were embarked that the destination of Dieppe was revealed. Later that evening, Ham Roberts joined his command vessel, HMS Calpe, and at 8 p.m. the entire force sailed by moonlight to face the enemy. 237 ships and landing craft cut through the Channel swell that night. This included 6 destroyers to provide fire support, as well as motor gunboats and landing ships of assorted variants. One observer at a destroyer's rail described the crossing. We passed the infantry assault ships gliding along like dark grey ghosts, with moonlight reflecting like jewels in the trailing wakes. In the distance, dim shapes of other destroyers and gunboats were barely visible now and again through the slight surface haze. No lights, no noise, all was dark and still. 0 hour was planned for 4:50 AM British summertime, the beginning of nautical twilight. But at 03:47, a star shell went up to the starboard of Group 5, craft carrying the commandos destined for the yellow beaches, bathing them in a horrible, quivering semi-daylight. A small German convoy of armed merchantmen and E-boats had crossed the group's path, and the E-boat guns made quick work of Group 5. The Germans had the better of the engagement, and after 15 minutes of chaos, they disengaged and slipped back into the night, leaving 5 landing craft too damaged to go on, another 5 wallowing full of dead and wounded, and only 7 able to carry on towards the beaches. Just one of those made it to Yellow 2. The officer on board, Captain Peter Young, now had only 23 men to take the Goebbels battery, 10% of his intended force. Young led his band of desperados up a cliff, past barbed wire obstacles, through a minefield and around to the rear of the battery. Here they waited. But as time ticked away and an armada of aircraft roared above, Young realised that the simultaneous assault from Yellow 1 wasn't coming. So, taking the initiative, he ordered his men to start harassing the battery from the surrounding cornfields, distracting the 200 Germans from the fleet approaching Dieppe below. Amazingly, it worked, and the main force weren't interfered with by Goebbels' battery on their run in. At Yellow 1 it was a different story. Around 120 commandos landed here, including 6 US Rangers. However, due to the skirmish at sea and their more exposed running, they'd lost any element of surprise. They too scaled the cliffs, weaving around wire and mines, but at the crest came under heavy fire from an alert German garrison. Casualties soon mounted. After a bloody hour and a half, they pulled back down to the beach, but as their craft came to take them off, the boats were reduced to burning hulks. Of the 120 men who landed, 37 died at Yellow 1, and the rest went in the bag, many of them wounded. One of the dead was US Ranger Lieutenant Edward Lustelot, a 23-year-old from Franklin, Louisiana. He has the unenviable claim to be the first American killed in action facing the Germans on European soil. When that star shell burst above No. 3 Commando, Lord Lovett and No. 4 were approaching the Orange Beaches 13 miles to their west. Lovett immediately ordered all ahead, full speed, and within minutes his craft clanked onto pebbles and 152 commandos were disgorged. German pillbox crews and mortar teams up on the cliffs opened up, felling several of the soaked and heavily laden attackers. But the highly trained commandos moved fast and low in small groups, posting grenades through concrete slits, cutting communication lines and silencing any opposition near the landing sites. As Lovett's men moved up from Orange 2, stalking through the fields to flank Hess Battery, his second in command, Major Derek Mills Roberts, and his team moved up more directly from Orange 1 to pin the defenders down, the anvil to Lovett's hammer. Soon Mills Roberts' men were in position, and on his signal they let hell loose on the battery. As well as rifle and Bren gun fire, a 2-inch mortar had been set up. This added its thump, whistle and crash to the commando's dawn chorus, and remarkably, with just 2 rounds, utterly gutted the battery. A lucky hit right on the main ammunition dump caused an almighty explosion and a huge sheet of flame. With just 1 shot, No. 4 Commando had achieved their mission. Hess Battery was silenced. Silenced but not destroyed. By 6:10 AM, Lovett's men were in position ready to assault it. After a flight of Spitfires strafed the now burning battery, Lovett fired a flare, and with blood up and bayonets fixed, his 100 men charged the position. As the commandos rushed forward, defenders sheltering in the bunkers and tunnels re-emerged and swept the ground with MG-34 fire and lobbed stick grenades, killing many. Captain Pat Porteous, an attached artillery officer, took over but was wounded twice leading the charge before falling, shot through both legs, an act that earned him the Victoria Cross. The ferocity and speed of the charge soon overwhelmed the defenders, who were forced to fall back before being dispatched by commandos clearing the complex room by room. Only 4 prisoners were taken. Any remaining guns were then blown up before the Union flag was run up over the battery. The job done, Lovett and his men gathered their wounded and captives and withdrew back to their boats. With the Hessen-Goebbels batteries distracted or neutralised, the main invasion had a clear run into the beaches around Dieppe itself. But for the assault to truly have any chance of success, the guns at Rommel Battery above Blue Beach also needed to be silenced. Unfortunately, due to a mix-up when the Royals were loading into their assault craft, they were now running 30 minutes behind schedule, a huge issue in a plan so reliant on the element of surprise. So, by the time the first wave was approaching the shore, it was coming on daylight. The Germans defending Puy were alert and clicking off their safety catches as they watched the Royals approach. 100 yards from the beach, rounds started to clang into the sides of the landing craft assaults. When bow doors swung open, the densely packed rows of Royals started board. MG-34 fire scythed into them. Men clambered over the bodies of their mates or rolled over the sides into deeper water in the rush to escape. A few men made it here to the seawall, where they lay desperately trying to make themselves as small as possible. Those who went to the aid of the wounded were often killed in the act. A mortar team tried to set up their tube were immediately wiped out. Enfilade fire covered the whole beach, and a concrete bunker sitting in the garden of a villa on the eastward slope covered almost every inch of the shore. The machine gun inside probably accounted for more Canadian dead than any single German weapon that day. 20 minutes after the first wave landed, the second wave came ashore. It was hopeless. There were more grist to the mill of MG-34 and mortars. Lieutenant William Wedd, a 27-year-old British Columbian, lost 2/3 of his platoon in the first minutes, and on identifying the pillbox responsible, breached the wire with a Bangalore torpedo and rushed the pillbox on his own, killing the occupants with a well-posted grenade. but he was riddled by bullets in the process and died against the concrete of the bunker. Seeing the terrible scene unfolding on Blue Beach, the Black Watch gallantly came ashore earlier than planned to help. They too ended up cut to pieces or pinned down in the shadow of the seawall. When the Germans eventually emerged to round up prisoners here at 8 AM, they saw and captured an apocalyptic scene. One survivor from the Royals described it saying, "It was unbelievable. There were boots with feet in them, there with legs. There were bits of flesh, there were guts, there were heads. This was my regiment. These were the guys I'd lived with for the last 2.5 years. Of the 556 men who landed on Blue Beach, more than 200 men were killed and 264 taken prisoner. The Royals had ceased to exist." Those to the west of Dieppe at Green Beach were faring better. 523 South Saskatchewans came ashore at Pourville on time at 4:50 AM. They landed in one wave, still covered by darkness, and it was only as the last craft came ashore that the enemy opened up. However, as they breached the wire defences into the village, they realised they'd been put ashore in the wrong place. They were to the west of the River Sea, and their objectives lay on the opposite side. This meant crossing this narrow, exposed bridge that was well covered by enemy fire. It was 100 feet long and 20 wide, with wire entanglement channeling approaches at both ends, and mortars and machine guns ranged onto it from the slopes above. The first men who made it across were abruptly brought up by the withering fire of pillboxes on the slope ahead. For half an hour they were pinned down until Private Charles Sorden, with a grenade in each hand, casually strolled up the road and lobbed them through the gun slits, killing the 4 Germans inside. Moments later, Sorden too lay dead, but his bravery allowed A companies to continue their advance, zigzagging up the eastern slope, crawling towards a gun battery and radar station. The mortar fire brought down on them, though, was appalling. So while they managed to clear the small battery on the cliff top, by the time the survivors reached the radar station perimeter, it was clear that it was an objective too far. Back in Pourville, the Camerons had landed to the skirl of bagpipes and hoped to move through a subdued village towards their airfield objective 3 miles inland. Instead, their commanding officer was killed as he stepped onto the beach, and most of their 500 soldiers ended up joining the fight alongside the Saskatchewans. At this point, the South Saskatchewan's commanding officer, 33-year-old Colonel Charles Merritt, realised that the fight to get across the bridge was stalling. Leading by example, he removed his helmet and, wiping the sweat from his eyes, he walked out onto the bridge in front of his men. As he stood there with bullets kicking up around his feet, he waved his helmet and shouted, "Come on over, there's nothing to it." About 40 men duly rushed across, several falling to bullets. Once across, Merritt went back for more. He did so at least 4 times, and by the end the dead were piled 2 deep along the span of the bridge. But the bulk of the 2 companies were across. By now, the pillbox Private Sorden had so gallantly neutralised had been reoccupied and was again holding up the advance. Merritt ordered a mortar to lay smoke before he loped up to the pillbox and blew it up. This was the pattern all the way to Quatre Vents Farm at the western slope. But it again became clear that the attackers had neither the numbers nor the firepower to break into the position. After 3 hours of non-stop fighting, the Canadians were forced to pull back to the beaches to evacuate. Colonel Merritt stayed behind to cover the withdrawal, giving his men time to be taken off in the landing craft. After expending all ammunition, he was taken prisoner. Upon liberation, he was presented with the Victoria Cross. Some 260 men were captured at Pourville alongside Merritt, while 225 others still rest in cemeteries nearby. With the disaster at Blue Beach and the ultimate withdrawal at Green, a crucial element of the Jubilee plan to secure the flanking headlands for the main assault had failed. Of course, those landing at the town's main beach, sectors Red and White, didn't know this. As the craft carrying the Rileys and Essex Scottish approached the coast, the men inside witnessed an almighty bombardment of naval high explosive and smoke shells on the shore batteries. Above roared flights of Boston light bombers and Hurricanes. The idea was for the main attack to go in with a heavy air and naval fire saturation of the town's defences, which would lift in time for the tanks to grind ashore and take over. They would then pulverise any surviving positions before infantry landed to take their objectives and clear the way off the beach. But timing was everything, and the tanks were running late. The first 9 rolled off their LCTs at around 5:35, 15 minutes later than planned, by which time the bombardment had lifted and the German defenders had returned to man their guns. A squadron of the Cavalry Regiment landed on White Beach and B squadron landed on Red. While the first 3 waves of LCTs managed to get 27 of their 30 tanks onto the beach, the tanks were reliant on engineer squads to clear obstacles and lay tracks over the pebbles so they could drive off the beach. But as soon as the engineers stepped onto land, they were mown down by enemy fire. This left nearly half the tanks stranded, with pebbles clogging up their bogies, exposed to enemy fire where they were picked off one by one. B Squadron, whose tanks all had names starting with B, were particularly hard hit, as this famous footage, shot by a German news team that day, shows. Remarkably, 15 tanks did make it onto the promenade, but there they were confined by obstacles that, without their engineers, they couldn't breach. As the surviving tanks fired impotently at still functioning batteries on the headlands, the infantry was landing. The Essex Scottish came ashore at Red Beach to find a hill of beach pebbles being turned into shrapnel by shell burst and rolls of unbroken barbed wire. Despite men throwing themselves down on the wire for others to run across their backs, the guts were torn out of the Essex Scottish within minutes. One company of 108 lost all but 38 men just getting to the seawall. Responsible for much of the slaughter were the machine gun nests built into caves in the chalk cliffs overlooking the beach. These were invulnerable to aerial bombardment or a destroyer's 4-inch shell, and they flickered out belt-fed death with impunity. Commander control soon shattered, and with radio sets lost, there was no way to tell Ham Roberts on HMS Calpe that they needed to abort. To survive, they needed to get off the beach and into the town, but to gain the seawall meant fighting through thickets of wire entanglement under the guns of the enemy. Despite heroic, self-sacrificing bravery, the Essex Scottish attack died on the wire, leaving it festooned with the bodies of Canadians. To the west, the Rileys were faring only slightly better. Like the Essex Scottish, they were hammered by fire and caught up in wire as they attempted to advance past burning tanks. The capture of their first objective, a beachfront casino, began with a lone soldier crawling forward through wire and taking out an abutting pillbox. Its capture would require the entire battalion and take nearly 2 hours. Using mousehole charges, the Rileys moved from room to room within the casino, killing or capturing Germans inside as they went. Using the casino as a launch pad, the Rileys now pushed men east into the town to try and help the beleaguered Essex Scottish. Only 2 groups managed to penetrate the town's defences. Captain Tony Hill and men from B Company made it across the seafront boulevard and tried to force their way up Rue de Cigogne. There they were forced back and ended up embroiled in running street battles before falling back to the casino. Another group to get into the town was led by Engineer Sergeant George Hickson. His 18-man strong team made it as far as the Rue de la Barre, where they killed a sniper with a boy's anti-tank rifle before clearing a house in hand-to-hand fighting. Having exhausted their ammunition, they too fell back to the casino. Against all odds, a section of the Essex Scottish headquarters personnel, cooks and drivers detailed to protect battalion headquarters, also made it into the town. Led by Company Sergeant Major Tommy Stapleton, they landed in a later wave and during a lull in the fighting, dashed madly across the seawall into a hotel where they killed 2 German defenders before proceeding to shoot up German trucks and positions with their Bren and Thompson machine guns. This limited break-in, however, led to a miscommunication that the Essex Scottish had reached the town in force, leading Roberts to commit his floating reserve, Le Fusilier Montréal, a decision that would seal the fate of Operation Jubilee. By 7 a.m. the Fusiliers were on their way into the crucible of hell. Lieutenant Colonel Maynard, the Fusiliers' CO, wounded just seconds after landing, would famously write, "Not even a cat could move on the beach or promenade. Anyone who tried was immediately immobilized by a gust of machine gun fire or a sniper's bullet, not to mention mortar bombs and artillery shells. They were even firing at the corpses, as if they wanted to kill them again." By 9 a.m. it was clear that the only choice was to withdraw. The re-embarkation was brought forward to 11 o'clock to allow time for air cover to regroup. For most of the men on Dieppe's beaches, this signalled the start of another appalling ordeal. The battle was lost, and now it became a struggle to stay alive until the boats could lift them off. Captain the Reverend John Foote, the Rileys' padre, attached himself to a makeshift regimental aid post in a stranded LCT on White Beach. He personally darted out time and again to carry casualties in before dressing their wounds. When the LCT was hit by shell fire and ammunition within started cooking off, he rescued casualties and moved them again, one after the other. The withdrawal stretched the RAF's abilities. They had to simultaneously bomb and strafe the coastal defences, lay smoke to cover the boats and contend with the Luftwaffe. The boat pool of landing craft had to be organised by loudhailer over the din of explosions and gunfires. It was a near suicidal prospect, and only half of the 36 craft sent in to evacuate the Canadians even made it to the beaches. Those few immediately became swamped by the sheer weight of numbers of those trying to climb aboard. Of the 8 landing craft that arrived to lift off the Essex Scottish, 6 were hit by shell fire and sunk. When the smoke suddenly lifted, the few craft escaping with troops were caught in the open. The shore batteries rained death and destruction down on them again. The last radio messages from Red Beach paint a stark picture of the end of the Dieppe Raid. 13:05. Give us quick support. Enemy closing in on beach. Hurry it up, please. 13:08. There seems to be a mass surrender of our troops to the Germans on the beach. Our people have surrendered. Of the over 6,000 soldiers who set off on the raid, just over half returned to England. Of those left behind, 980 were dead or would die of their wounds. 2,010 remained, many wounded, consigned to captivity for the next 3 years. Like all tragic defeats, Dieppe saw a bountiful crop of awards in its wake. 61 military crosses and military medals, 12 distinguished service orders and 3 Victoria Crosses, including one for the Rileys' chaplain, John Foote, who chose to go into captivity with his wounded flock. Within days of the raid, the Times was already parroting the words of Mountbatten and combined operations, justifying the loss as a dress rehearsal for a second European front. This legend remains with us today, Dieppe's preparation for D-Day. Following this line, Dieppe's failings become partially responsible for Hobart's funnies, including swimming DD tanks, armoured landing craft, the need for overwhelming naval fire support, the use of paratroopers, and the criticality for air superiority. On the eve of D-Day, General Creyrat told the men of the 3rd Canadian Division about to land on Juno Beach. The plan, the preparations, the method and technique which will be employed are based on knowledge and experience bought and paid for by the 2nd Canadian Division at Dieppe. Their contribution cannot be overestimated. It will prove to have been the essential prelude to our forthcoming and final success. Thanks for watching. If you found this video interesting, be sure to check out our full-length virtual battlefield tours available via Patreon and YouTube membership sections below. By joining, not only do you get access to detailed historical breakdowns of major battles from throughout history, but your support allows us to create more free content just like this right here on YouTube. And if you'd like to know more about World War II in general, why not try out our podcast, World War II Both Sides of the Wire, where each week our leading historians explore major aspects of the conflict from both the Allied and Axis perspectives. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.